just wanted to, we do have a pretty amazing season of author presentations this fall. And usually our events are always on Wednesday, but for some reason this fall they seem to be sliding to Friday as well, because we have people coming from further afield. And we have a few occasional Saturdays, like Lizzie Boyd and Tommy DePaula, who actually, did anybody hear his interview on NPR this morning?
No.
Tommy DePaula was interviewed about his new book, Quiet, which is all about basically disengaging with your devices and engaging in the world. And it was just a really sweet interview. He's a wonderful man. That's an aside. Next Wednesday, we are hosting Micah Perks, who is coming to this coast to do some teaching at Dartmouth for a short period. And so she's going to be here in conversation with another author, Peter Orner, who also teaches across the river, and talking about her book of their collected story, linked stories, I guess you'd call them. It's called True Love and Other Dreams of a Miraculous Escape, which I think is a pretty amazing title. 2 weeks from tonight, Walter Wetherell, W.D. Wetherell, who lives in Lyme, has a brand new collection of short stories. We just got it in today. And he'll be here talking about that. And in November, we have Madeline Cunin with her new memoir about heading into the 80s. And Ed Koren, who has a collection of his cartoons, his Fuzzy People cartoons. And so they'll be here in November. And then in December, our big author event is George Howe Colt, who wrote The Big House, and he has a new book called The Game, and it's basically a snapshot of this country and culture in 1968, and it's centered around a Harvard-Yale game, but I'm not a football person, and I thoroughly enjoyed the book. And we do have an electronic newsletter if you're not signed up, so you can keep track of all of this. But tonight, we welcome Joesph Olshan. And usually when Joe sends me an email, it's to announce a new book coming from Delphinium Press. So it was a little surprising when a few months ago he wrote that he had a new book coming, Black Diamond Fall. He's published now 11 novels, and the first being the award-winning Clara's Heart, which maybe some of you have read. And then it's been 6 years since Cloudland was published, and that was set here in the Upper Valley. It was sort of interesting to be reading a novel about the place I drive every day. He's written extensively for newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Guardian. And he's also taught graduate and undergraduate courses in creative writing at New York University. And a little bit about the publisher he works for, because it's pretty amazing little publisher. It was founded in 1986, and it publishes original voices in contemporary society. And its first book was an anthology that featured our own Grace Paley. So it just circles right back to the Upper Valley. But this new book, Black Diamond Fall, is set in present time. And so you've got cell phones and tracking devices and things that wouldn't be in a mystery that was set even 10 years ago. And it's based, even though it's based on two historical events, one was set in 1971, which was the disappearance of a Middlebury student, and 2007 when the Frost House was vandalized. They're both part of what happens here. And a reviewer for Booklist wrote, "As much an engrossing and rich examination of the consequences of desire as it is a painstakingly and sublimely constructed mystery." I thought that was an interesting balance of two parts of praise. So without further ado,
Thank you.
the floor is yours.
Thank you,
You're
Liza.
welcome.
And I have to say, I mean, we're talking about presses and writers, but I love doing events here, and especially it's a really wonderful independent bookstore who supports us writers, and I love to support them. And so, even if you don't buy my book tonight, you should buy a book from the bookstore. I just want to make one slight correction because I need to. They're actually the disappearance of the Middlebury student. There was a disappearance in 1971, but the student that I'm writing about actually disappeared in 2007. So right around the time the frost. And there's a reason why I'm saying this, because something really amazing happened to me last week when I was on my book tour in New Mexico. But I'll get to that. I just want to say this, that I've made my career writing what's called literary fiction. And before my last book, Cloudland, was published, I had a conversation with my literary agent who said, well, Joe, you've written about being Jewish, you've written about being white, you've written about being gay, you've written about love. There's really nothing more you can do. So if you have to find another venue to express some of these thoughts and ideas, and I think you should consider, since you are a narrative writer, the sort of suspense, sort of mystery genre. And so I actually really thought about that, and I had heard about this story of these women who had disappeared in the Upper Valley in the late 80s. And one of my friends actually had discovered one of the bodies, and so this was my way in writing about it. So that was my first book. But in the midst of doing some research for the first book, I heard a story about this young man at Middlebury College who disappeared. And a psychic that I know told me that she had been called in to help them try to solve the disappearance of this young man. And so she ended up, this woman had two or three children. She ended up meeting the parents of this young man, and became sort of very bonded to them, and was very affected by the fact that they couldn't find their son, and she had some ideas. And she ultimately helped them solve the crime, but it wasn't a crime actually. It was a disappearance that probably had to do with him having a few drinks and going out out for a walk in the middle of the winter, and falling down, and probably not getting up, and just freezing and being hidden, and then eventually he was close to the Otter Creek and his body went into the river. So as Liza said, the novel is framed with this, and also the vandalism of the Robert Frost house. But I have to tell you the story of what happened to me last week, because it really kind of resonates, and I think it's important for this. So I have been going around the country promoting this book, and I tell the story of this young man. It's based on the disappearance of a young man at Middlebury College, and the way I tell it is that the way I was telling it is he's from Arizona, the West, and he had come to the college. This is his second year, and he couldn't really afford to go home for the holidays, so he stayed on campus when it was shut down. And so the fact that he disappeared wasn't really noticed right away because there were so few people on campus. And so that was my way into the novel, and so I was out west, and I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I was doing a reading at a very, really nice independent bookstore, very much like this one. And some people that I knew came, my partner and some of his coworkers came, and there was a young man who was sitting in the front row who was probably maybe late 20s, early 30s. So I did my whole spiel. I talked about the book. I talked about how I came to write these sorts of novels. And afterwards he came up to me and he said to me, "This person that disappeared from Middlebury College, you said he was from Arizona?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, was this guy's name Nick Garza?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, actually he was from Albuquerque, and he was my best friend." Wow. So I was really shocked. I mean, I guess he had heard about this event, and he wanted to sort of make contact with me. So my first thought about this was, I had done a television spot earlier in the day, and I thought, oh my gosh, if I had talked about this on television, it could have been really interesting. But then I thought to myself, no, because this man's family probably lives in Albuquerque, and maybe it was good that I made the mistake. I think that if I had identified him any more than I had, maybe somebody would have spoken to his family, and I sort of went into this kind of inner turmoil about what we should write about and what we have to sort of keep as sacred. And at the end of the day, I decided that it was good that I didn't know that he was from Albuquerque. But nevertheless, I was really shocked, especially because this person who was his best friend came. And the sad thing about it was, and this guy looked very sad, is that they were best friends, and they lost touch for a year, and then the guy went to Middlebury, and he never saw him again, and then the guy died. So anyway, but back to what I'm writing in this novel and what I'm writing in general, I sort of came to the conclusion that I needed to tell a story in either a suspense or sort of thriller-esque genre, and I would say that I sort of rely more on suspense. And one of my models is the writer Wilkie Collins, who wrote The Woman in White and The Moonstone, and he was a contemporary of Dickens. And I would argue that Wilkie Collins might be as good a writer as Dickens in the sense that he really does a beautiful job with female characters. And if you haven't read any of his books, I would highly recommend them. He's a wonderful writer, but he does write suspenseful fiction, and he was one of perhaps the first people that wrote suspense fiction, and it's called, in sort of the academic parlance, it's called the novel of sensation. But on my way to an event in Concord a few weeks ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who actually is probably the only person in the United States who teaches an MFA program who actually teaches suspense and mystery writing. And she said to me something that really resonated. She said, if you have the reader in suspense, either by a crime or some mystery, that you can go anywhere, basically. And so this was written about somewhere, and so what I did was I sent it to her. Somebody picked it up and wrote about it, and I sent it to her. And so she wrote me back, and she said, well, that's true, but it's actually this, and I just want to read you what she said, because I think it's really interesting. This is Lynn Barrett, who teaches at the university, in Florida International University in the MFA program. I believe I said that I'd found in that class that once there's a crime, whether it is at the fore, as in traditional mystery and suspense genres, or perhaps set back in the past or to the side, but still there in what is often classified as literary fiction, a crime reverberating across generations in a family, for instance, you've got the reader's interests. It's about something, and you can do lots of different things with it. But also, yes, that using mystery and suspense framework opens up the chance to write about all sorts of human experience and relationships. So that does so much a better job of describing of what I'm trying to do in my novels now, as opposed to what I was trying to do before. And for me, the challenge is taking events that have happened that I can sort of muse on and infusing my own personal life in these events. My last novel, Cloudland, was probably less personal than Black Diamond Fall. I did have a way into it by a story that my close friend told me of finding this body in the snow, and so that kind of began an incantation in my head, which then led me to muse on the other victims of the crime, and then sort of to create a story around that. But the problem for me when I was writing that book is that, and actually this woman I'm mentioning, this writer, read an early draft of the book, and so I gave her the early draft of the book, and she said, Joe, she said, listen, you're changing genres here. I just got to give you one piece of advice. If you're going to be writing a novel, a mystery novel, or in the mystery suspense genre, no matter how literary, you have to suspect more than one person. The reader, there's a readership out there that will clobber you, and if you don't give them what they want, and that's the reason why a lot of people write in the mystery suspense genre, because there is a built-in readership. So you have to suspect several different people. You just can't have it one suspect. Of course, that came as a surprise to me, because quite honestly, I don't read a lot of mystery and suspense fiction, and so I really had to learn as I went along, and I also had to realize that if you're going to dip your toe into the genre, you're going to have readers' expectations, which is different than literary fiction. And some literary fiction, by the way, and I say this because I'm an editor, could use some more plot. It can be very baggy, and there aren't enough editors out there that are telling writers that they need to sort of get the story moving. So in the case of this particular novel, I had two stories that I wanted to write about. One of the disappearance of the young man, the Middlebury college student, and then the fact that the Robert Frost house was vandalized in around the same time. somehow I knew I wanted to bring them together, but I didn't know how I could bring them together. And I am unlike a lot of writers that I know. A lot of writers I know actually do these very careful outlines of what they're going to do. And I have an enormous amount of respect for that. But it's not the way I work, because I really have to discover what I'm doing as I am writing it. And it's just a different method. It's no better, it's no worse, but it's the way I work, and I can't work by an outline because invariably something is going to change. So I knew that I wanted to write to write about these two events and to bring them together. But I also wanted it to be a more personal novel than Cloudland. And I think that this young man who disappeared at Middlebury, I was able to use him as a template to write about a situation that I was in with a much younger person, and use all the intensity around that, and use this actual person who disappeared as the template for everything that I wanted to write about, and also to sort of use that as a center of the book, and then have other people in the book, even the detectives who are investigating the crime, to reflect on this relationship between an older man and a younger man, and the intensity of it, but the fact that the relationship is pulled apart. And one of the things that I tried to do in the novel, when I had one of the detectives investigating, is that this detective is probably the same age as my middle-aged protagonist, and he's married in a relationship that he feels is dead, and he loves his wife, but his wife doesn't really love him. And he comes to envy despite the fact that the male protagonist who was involved with the younger man, the detective comes to envy the suspect, an older man whom he's investigating, because at least he has a relationship it's alive and is passion, and meant something a great deal to him. So these are the basic frameworks that I was working in, and of course then you have to tell a story, and you have to somehow have other characters who are related to the character that you're writing about, or the central character who is the disappeared young man. Now, interestingly, one of the reviews of this book really struck me. And in the last line of the review was something about the reviewer was pointing out all the lies that people tell one another in the novel, and I just had no idea that this was going on. And I thought, yeah, I guess it's true. I guess people do really lie to each other. I mean, the students that are involved with this young man who disappears, who are his friends, and two of them who were his lovers, or one of them was his lover, a woman, lie about their relationship to him, and they lie to the police, and then other people lie to the police, and there's a whole bunch of lying that goes on in the novel, which the police have to try to unravel. And I never realized this until till I read this review. And of course, everybody has a reason for lying, and the most important reason is that some of these students who were with this man, and when he disappeared, don't want the police to know that they were with him, because they don't want to be investigated, and they're afraid of being suspected. So that's the basic framework of the book, and I feel like I'd like to talk about how I came to write it more than actually read. I mean, I don't know if you all have, when you come to readings, you have people read, but my thought is to sort of open this up to discussion, and also to try to weave in the fact that I too am a publisher, as Liza mentioned, and a very large part of my life is acquiring and editing other people's books, and it's a difficult job. It brings me a great deal of satisfaction and excitement, and sometimes it's even more exciting than what I'm doing in my own career. So I mean, I'm happy to take questions about what it's like to be an editor, what it's like to be acquiring editor, and publishing other writers. I've had the distinct opportunity to edit Pulitzer Prize winning writers, and National Book Award winning and nominated writers, and by the way, I find that the more established writers are easier to edit than the first timers. With the first timers, there's lots of pushback, and sometimes they drive me crazy. They really do, But anyway, so any questions? Anybody want to sort of start a discussion, or? Yes.
So I have a question. As a writer, do you ever, as an editor, do you ever see a script, a manuscript come in that the idea is great, but the writing really isn't, and you wish you could take it and
Well, you know,
really
it's
redo it?
You want to fix it.
Well, it's interesting because I had thought that, first of all, we get some good submissions, but we don't pay a lot of money. So often, books will go to bigger publishers who pay more, and then if they don't buy them, we get the. And sometimes we'll get books that need a lot of work, but I can see the potential. And so, I sort of bill myself as the person who can really edit and pull a book up. But I have to be honest with you, the couple times that I've done it, it's just too hard, and it caused me a lot of stress. So now I don't want to do that anymore. Interestingly, the book that I mentioned to you that's talked about in the New York Times today as one of this group of dystopian sort of feminist science fiction, this book needed a tremendous amount of work, and we almost turned it down. And what happened basically was that we had published, this is a Pakistani writer, by the way, whose name is Bina Shah, and she wrote a novel called Before She Sleeps, which is about, it's a sort of Handmaid's Tale that takes place in Pakistan. And in fact, Margaret Atwood ended up giving her a blurb after the book was published, which was a big deal for us. But we had published an earlier novel of hers, which was very, very finished when she sent it to us, but she sent me this, and it needed a lot of work. And my publisher, the woman I report to, wanted to turn the book down. And I said, we can't, because this is our author. We really have to try to give her a chance. And this poor woman, I made her go through, and she was such a good sport about it. She did basically everything, except maybe one line that she didn't want to change. And the book got a start, Publishers Weekly, and it's gotten great reviews, and it's been talked about, and it's been L.A. Times and the New York Times. The New York Times just did a piece on her and these other writers. So it's done really, really well for us, and yet we almost turned this book down. We almost turned it down. And it obviously I think it got a lot better. I mean, I hope it did, but it seems to, because there has been one single bad review of this book so far.
Wow.
So, questions, anybody, or?
I'm thinking about
Yeah.
the author and just wondering, does she still feel ownership of the book?
Yeah, it's interesting
That's
because
tricky.
we did a there's a website called The Millions, which is a literary website, and we actually did a Q&A together, and I interviewed her. This was sort of set up by the publicist, and then we went back and forth, and I was asking her questions about the writing process, and then she ended up asking me questions about my writing process. But one of the questions I said to her was, I know this is really tough, and there were some difficult moments, and so how do you feel about this? And she said that she felt that it was worth it. She felt that what she got was a better book. But the thing is that I have the luxury of publishing 5 or 7 books a year, and I do it all myself. I mean, I edit all myself. But people in my position at bigger houses have so many books, and they just can't. They don't have the time to edit, and so what happens is you have a lot of books that are not really being edited.
Right.
And that's number one. Number two, it's falling to the agent to edit the book. And so I try to give everything to my authors that I don't think I ever had as a writer. And
That's great.
unfortunately, even though I've had some really, really good publishers, I haven't had the best editors. And I've had to get a lot of my editorial input from friends who are other writers. I mean, that's for me what the best input I've ever gotten. But I like to think that my authors, I try to give them whatever I possibly can, and it's a lot of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the next question is, well, do you learn about this process from doing that? And I have to quote Grace Paley, who was one of my mentors, and she told me once that she said, every time I sit down to write, I have to learn how to write all over again. And that was, of course, somebody who's a master of the short story. That was really interesting to hear. And I think that it's every time you sit down, you have to wrestle with the material. So I can point out all these mistakes that my writers are making, but then I'll make the same mistakes myself. Because obviously I don't have the same kind of objectivity towards my own work that I have towards the work of the people that I edit. So, you had a question.
Yeah. When you dive into a new genre like this, or at least a new direction, you got your storyline that you want to put together.
Sort of, yeah, yeah.
When you start, or let's say the first 25% of writing it, you have an inventory of characters. How often do you have to go in and dive into the barrel and find new characters as you go along because you've painted yourself into a situation where I need more
Well,
than I thought I did to carry off the character density that you want for the message?
well, I'm going to answer this question a little bit obliquely because I discovered that it's impossible for me to have a main character in a novel that's not based on somebody that I know. And if I go back through all the fiction that I've written, the main characters, I mean, some of them are based on me, but also like family, Jennifer, and you know, I have a friend, Francesca Durante, who's an Italian novelist, and Eric and Piper and Jennifer know her, and she was a main character in one of my previous novels, and of course, she's a larger-than-life character. Wouldn't I want to write about her? Yeah. So, so I have to, I'm sort of constrained in the sense that I really need to write about people that I know, and somehow, the minor characters I can invent, but I can't invent a major character. I feel like, I don't know if it's that I can't do it. I feel that it's almost sacrilegious in a way, and I can't quite describe why. So, I mean, there's always a room for a character that you can create, but if it's sort of beyond the ken of people that if it's a major character, then I'm in trouble. Because I think if at least I believe if I really try to make a major character out of thin air, that it's gonna fall flat. And for me, characterization is really important, and it's a principle that I've always adhered to, and people who write mystery suspense they're often more interested in plot and situation than they are in character, but I feel character drives the novel, and good, well-drawn characters also help you figure out plot and how to bring things together. For example, in this book, I brought the Robert Frost farm and together with this disappearance of the student at Middlebury. And by the way, I don't know if any of you know the story of the Robert Frost vandalism. And this is actually in the novel, but I had to take it out because it didn't work. But so it was a bunch of high school students who vandalized the Robert Frost farm, and so when they were caught and they were sentenced, I guess they were sentenced. They had some kind of sentencing, either it was community service, but they were also sentenced to study Robert Frost poetry with Jay Perini for 3 weeks at Middlebury. So they had to study Robert Frost poetry. Now that is a great kind of irony. And I actually had it in this novel, but what happened was that the vandals in an earlier draft, who were these high school kids, I realized I had to get rid of them because they didn't really have a place in the book, and so I made 2 other characters who had a more central place in the book, responsible for the vandalism. And that kind of sort of answers your question in reverse. I had 2 characters. I had 2 characters too many, and I had to cut them out. And by the way, the other thing that I cut out of this book was that the psychic that I mentioned, who told me about the disappearance of this young man and her involvement with the family, she had a role in my previous novel, Cloudland, and I brought her into this book, and then I realized she didn't belong, so I had to take her out too. So, and maybe it was a good idea, because sometimes if you have a recurring character, if they're not a main character, people question you. And by the way, all these books where they have all these recurring characters, I don't know how these people do it. I just can't imagine writing one book after another where the character keeps coming back. I mean, I once did a sequel to my first novel, Clara's Heart, but I wrote that maybe 20 years later. So of course I had time to cogitate. But the writers who are able to churn out a book every year, every 2 years with the same character, my hat's off to them. I mean, I think Jodi Picoult does that, right?
It's not usually the same.
Oh no, so they're all standalone?
Archer
Yeah.
Mayer does.
Archer Mayer does, yeah.
Elizabeth
Yeah.
George.
Yeah, Elizabeth George, yeah.
Archer and Louise Penn.
Yeah.
And many others, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Do you always know what the wrap-up of the novel is when you start, or is
No.
that part of your process?
No, it's part of the process. I mean, I have an idea where I want it to end. And because of this book starts in a certain place, I knew I wanted to go back to where sort of the real action of the novel begins in Utah, and I knew that I had to go back to Utah when the book ends. But most of the book takes place in Vermont. So, yes.
Back to the editing and the new writers. From when you first started editing, I wondered if there was a difference between new writers before and now, if it's changed much, and also if you have a template or you just deal with each one individually as to how you deal with the pushback. And is there ever a time when new writers are just adamant and there's ever been a question about whether you'd even keep the book and tell them, well, you know?
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, that's what's so stressful about it. I mean, this book that we're publishing next April, I have to be careful. The author is an editor of a literary journal and has a lot of writer friends. And there is a third chapter of this book which just was clotted with flashbacks and descriptions, and we just kept trying to get her to change it, and she wouldn't change it. And the publisher was really, the publisher actually, I had to really push to acquire this book. This is another situation where I took on something that needed more work than maybe I should have realized that, but she wouldn't budget. And then finally I sent it to my copy editor, who is an editor emeritus at Norton, which is a very good New York publisher, and she edited books for years, and now she does copy editing, and she agreed with me. So we finally got this woman to make the changes, but still they're still not to my spec. I would still like it to be clearer. But we almost turned the book down, and I just finally, I mean, we got so far into it that we really couldn't. But and the thing that I find frustrating is that if someone was doing with me, I would be so grateful for someone to show me how I had clotted up a third chapter. But you know, the problem is that when you're dealing with someone who's an editor of a literary magazine and has lots of friends, you know, what they do is they say, well, this is what happened in this situation. Well, I showed it to 5 of my friends, and they all said that I'm right. So of course, they don't have the same kind of objectivity that the writer has. I don't want to indict this poor person, because actually the book is in really good shape, and it's a good novel, but it was really tough. Now Alison Lurie, who's a very famous Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, my time editing her, I mean, it's been a lot easier. And sometimes she pushes back and she says no, and I think, okay, well, she's 90 years old, so I'm not going to push this. But it's been a lot easier to deal with.
Have you found a difference between new writers back many years ago to now, or is it just pretty much the same new writers versus older, long-term writers?
Well,
and not that much difference in.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. So I'd like to refer to the manuscripts that I don't accept. It seems to me that since I started publishing myself, there's so many more writers out there, and that's because a lot of them go to these MFA programs, which, by the way, are fueling. They're carrying the costs of a lot of English departments in the U.S. I mean, there are so many writing programs, and they need them because there's so many people that want to be writers, and so that's going to give an English department money as opposed to someone who's going to go and get a master's and PhD. We just don't have those kinds of people anymore because they don't feel it's practical. But of course, writing is romanticized, still romanticized. So you have these students who come out of these programs, and there's a certain kind of sameness to the writing, and I think part of it is that people, because these programs are so competitive, that the writers are afraid to take risks, and so what happens is they kind of conform and they sort of produce these works that are very kind of similar. Also, I have to say, I mean, I don't know, there's a certain kind of compression that is lost now. I mean, if you think about back 25 or 30 years, before the internet, before iPhones, before all this stuff, when people were just reading books, going outside and playing when they were growing up, and not sort of hunkering down over a computer, I mean, it's good for it builds the imagination. But now younger people have so many outlets, and my fear is that there isn't the compression that builds up that there should build up. I mean, and a great example of compression is the 19th century. You have all these really, really wonderful novels, but people didn't have. I mean, they were sitting at home or they were traveling, but it took a long time to travel. It took a long time for a letter that you wrote to somebody to get to that person. So that is much more conducive to really fine fiction. And you see these books, for example, George Eliot, in writing some of her really long novels, I mean, she wrote them in a couple of years. And some of them are almost perfect. And how is she able to do that? And so I don't think there's the same talent today as there was. And I think part of that is that we have all these other outlets, these competing media, and also just students, younger people who are sort of getting diffused, their attention's getting diffused by phones and by videos and whatever Twitter and and social media and all that kind of stuff. I think it's not good for the writing world. I really don't. And yes, I mean, their critics are always going to be anointing writers and saying, oh, this person's a genius. But actually, I think that there aren't that many really, really fine writers that have come out in the last 20 years, I mean, in the younger generation. And the older generation, I think, is really, still has the writers that have really, really done something. And that's because a lot of them haven't grown up with social media and iPhones and all that. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, it just, when you said about the compression and whatever, I just had a thought, well, someday the great American novel may be, how many characters in a Twitter?
Yeah, no.
But how many, the great American novel will be
Right.
a great Twitter saying or something, you know what I mean? I don't know how many.
Well, people have already, people have actually written novels that are made up of Twitter posts. I mean, those have happened. I mean, I have not read any of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, haven't there? I'm asking you, because I
I'm
think you
sure
might
there
know.
are,
I thought since Piper's the youngest person, that she might
Trump's
know.
written a great deal of fiction.
Yeah, there you go. Absolutely. There you go. It's going to get collected, and it'll probably be published and become a bestseller.
Yeah.
With his audience anyway. But yeah, no, I think the quality of writing has it's just not the same, and I think it's because of this. And nobody, of course, wants to talk about that because it's really hard. The literary establishment has to be able to say, oh, here's this young writer who's a genius, because they don't want it to be they don't want there to be a vacuum. But I would have to say that a lot of stuff that gets published, I don't think is all that great, and stuff that's really, really great that gets published maybe by a smaller press doesn't get any recognition. So, and especially now, because there's so many books published. I mean, so many books published. I mean, you have no idea. And I mean, thousands of books a week are published, and of course, there's no venue for them. And there's certainly, the review space is shrunk too. I mean, it used to be. I mean, friends of mine and I talk about how it used to be when we publish a book, within 2 weeks, everybody reviewed it, like all the newspapers. But now it's not like that anymore. I mean, really well-known writers might get one review for their book, and it's just because there's a lot of competition, and also book review space has shrunk too. So now bloggers are taking up where book review editors are leaving off. Yes,
So this is a total shift from what you've
it's a
talked about.
fine.
I know that, or I believe that you write every day, or most days, that you get up and that you have a block of time and that you try to write. Is that?
When I'm working on it, I mean, I try to, but
So,
not always.
But right, I mean, everybody
Yeah.
takes vacation. But if you're writing all the time, do you always like sketch out or know where oh, right now I'm writing a book and it's going to be this kind of book, or do you ever just writing and then suddenly, 5 days in and 300 pages find that you're in the beginning of a novel?
Well, that's actually never happened to me. I mean, I've certainly thrown out the opening of books before, but I've never gone 300 pages and then found what I was writing about. People talk about that. I don't know if I would have the patience to sort of wait that long. And also too, I mean, as much as I would say that it's become harder to write as I've gotten older. But I'm more discerning about what's just not good, and I can just say, this is not any good, so I just throw it out. Whereas when I was younger, you'd like to think everything you're doing is really good, and now it's just you have to kind of fight to believe what you're doing is good.
But are you ever just writing without a novel in your mind?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm writing, trying to discover what the novel is I want to write, because I have the emotions that are going to fuel it. I mean, you have to be able to go the distance, right? I mean, just like when you're running a race, and you have to sort of, I mean, people, before they do marathons, don't they take that goo, or they just fuel their bodies and they go? So it's kind of like that. You have to, and what fuels you are these emotions, these very, very powerful emotions. And just like when I wrote this book, I had these very powerful emotions about getting older and my struggle with that, and also, the sort of the very passionate relationship that I had, which, lasted for a few years and then ended gracefully, actually, not like it does in this book. Because nobody wants to read a novel about somebody who's in a relationship that there's no problems and it ends gracefully. It just, it's not interesting. So you have to kind of change it.
Really appreciate it.
Yes.
So what are you working on now? Is there not
So I could
press?
talk about it. I don't mind talking about it. I'm writing a novel about it. I'm going back to my sort of high school and early college years, where I was sort of I mean, in the novel, the character based on me is goes to Boston College. But when I was in high school, late in high school and early in college, there was a kind of mentor. I had a mentor who was an Italian professor who taught at a very small college in White Plains, which was called Mercy College. It's a Catholic school. And he just, we used to go to his house and he would talk about literature, and then one day he just killed himself, and we had no idea why. And so that was kind of shocking. And so I decided I wanted to go back and write about that time, and try to figure out, at least in the novel, if this man killed himself or if he was forced to kill himself. So I've come up with this whole plot. And interestingly, in Cloudland, I was writing about Wilkie Collins. There's a manuscript by Wilkie Collins that's in this book. This book I write about Robert Frost. And in the new novel, the Italian writer Primo Levi has figures. And I don't know if any of you read Primo Levi, but he's a really wonderful Italian writer. Did not write fiction. He wrote nonfiction about his time in the concentration camps. And his book, Survival at Auschwitz, is probably the most famous and most beautiful account of a concentration life in a concentration camp that's ever been written. So that's basically what I'm doing, and I'm maybe 100 pages in. So, and it's a lot funnier than this book, I can tell you that. But as far as that, I don't really know where it's going to go. So, anybody have any more questions or? All right, well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you for supporting this wonderful bookstore.